Hey, hello everybody. How's it going? Here we are, back in the office, back in the office with the, ooh, I've got a marker. How are you? If you're here, I'm glad to be with you tonight. It is our first Monday night Bible study. So we've officially made the move over from Wednesdays to Mondays. So today is that first Monday. Hi, Alex. Hi, Tabby Cat. Hi, Brian. Yay, good. I'm glad you're here. Hi, Kaylin. We have moved from our Wednesdays to our Mondays because Wednesday nights, a lot of folks have church stuff. Hi, Robin. I always forget that you're Jade, and I look at it and I say Jade, and I forget that it's you, but I'll try to remember. Wednesdays, a lot of people have church stuff going on, and like whether it's like Bible studies or small groups or church like soup suppers or youth stuff. So I know a lot of people have Wednesday night stuff with their church, and so I wanted to move things over to Mondays. So that if you do have Wednesday night stuff, you don't have to choose between like doing stuff online and doing stuff in person. So thanks for hanging out and making that move over with me. Hi, Aiden. Yay. Yeah, so that's why we're moving over to Mondays. And I was almost late because late for our live stream because I was watching. I don't know if any of you watched the Bon Appetit videos where Claire and the gang try to recreate foods. But I was watching one, and then I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's 8 o'clock. We gotta go." So I'll have to watch how peeps are made later on. I hope you're all doing well. Hi, Golden Heart. Hi, Brian. Ooh, Brian, preaching your first sermon on Sunday. That's exciting. Congrats. You're gonna do great. You're gonna do great. Alex, it's totally okay if you gotta leave early. Nobody has to stick around any longer than they want to, I promise. Hi, Mask Warrior. Uh-oh, Alex says, is the audio weird for anyone else? I don't know. Is the audio weird, or can you all hear me okay? Let me know, and maybe I'll figure out if it's something going on with my headphones. It is weird. Okay, well, that's not good. Let me try without my headphones and see what happens. Okay, how about now? Let me know how it's sounding now. I might just sound like I'm in a more echoey room without my headphones, but let me know if this is okay. Check, check, test. I wish I had a way to test this before we did this, but I don't. I never know until you tell me. Let me know if this is better. Much better? Aiden says much better. Yes, okay, cool. Must just be my headphones then. I'm in echo mode. Sorry. This is what happens when you're in a room that is made of whiteboards and walls, is you're echoey. So I'll try to hang out closer to my mic and my computer so that you can hear me better. Sweet. Thanks for letting me know. Tonight, our topic tonight is dealing with rejection or the fear of rejection. That's what we're talking about. And this came about because basically I was thinking about in my own sort of personal spiritual life, how sometimes I feel like getting close to God or asking God to be with me or recognizing that God is with me, it can feel kind of like dangerous or scary sometimes. And so I was trying to figure out why that is. And I don't know if you've talked to me recently or you're in the Discord chat, you may know that I got to spend, not last weekend, but the weekend before, with a wonderful group of nuns. I went and did a retreat at a monastery nearby where I live. And I got to talk with them about their experiences with faith and spirituality. And that was a really interesting experience. But I got to sort of dig in a little bit to why the idea of God being with us can sometimes feel a little bit scary. And I realized that one of the things I think that happens, especially for LGBT folks, is we can sometimes have this sort of like expectation of rejection that we feel. especially if we've experienced rejection from like faith communities that we've been a part of. If you've been part of a church that has rejected you in any way, or has acted in negative ways towards other LGBT people, so you've kind of like extrapolated that onto yourself, we can kind of end up with this, like we're almost waiting to be rejected. We're almost like we expect that it's coming and we just don't know when it's coming. And so we can kind of internalize that sometimes. And so I've been thinking about how sometimes we can expect, without knowing it, we can have this subconscious expectation that God might reject us in some way. And it's tied up, I think, with shame and like experiences of shame sometimes. And that can also come from like negative experiences with faith communities and being told, not even with faith communities necessarily, just like in the wider culture, we hear all this stuff about like, well, Christians hate LGBT people, and we get this sort of larger narrative. And so we start to feel shame about who we are. Like, oh, maybe I can't be a queer Christian. Maybe I can't be a gay Christian or a trans Christian because like that's not what the narrative is telling me, right? So we can internalize this shame at the same time. So I was thinking about how can we look where in the Bible and in the gospel specifically can we see examples of people being worried that God will reject them? And what does that look like? So I was looking for stories where people seem to be worried about Jesus's rejection in the Gospels specifically. So we're going to look at two different stories and then one just little verse kind of at the end that I think is going to help us sum things up. But we're going to look at two stories. One of them is in the Gospel of Matthew and one's in the Gospel of Luke. So that's what we're going to start with. And we're going to start out with Matthew. So if you've got a Bible around and you want to turn to Matthew chapter 8, that's where we're going to start. And if you don't have a Bible around, the internet exists, which is wonderful. So I'm going to put this in the chat. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. So I'm going to put this in the chat for folks that want a link to the Bible Gateway version, and you can look up whatever version you usually read. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. So, Matthew 8, verses 5 through 13. Hi, Conrad. Glad you're here. I just put the passage in the chat, but we're reading Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. That's what we're going to start out with today as we think about what fear of rejection looks like in the Gospels. I dig your shirt. Thank you. This is one of my faves, actually. It's a nice thick shirt, which I enjoy in a short sleeve shirt. So here we go. Matthew 8, verses 5 through 13 is what we're going to start reading. This is the story of Jesus healing a centurion's servant. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress." And he said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And to the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." And the servant was healed in that hour. So that's the first story we're looking at, is the story of the centurion and his servant. And so my first question as we're reading through this is the first question that I always ask: were there any translation differences? If anybody noticed any translation differences that we might want to look at between the version that you read and the version that I just read. So if you have any good translation differences, throw those in the chat and we'll maybe take a look at them and see if they're just preference or if they might be something worth digging into a little bit. But this story is one that shows up in the Synoptic Gospels. Actually, no, it's in Matthew and Mark and John. It's one that's weird because it also shows up in John, which is an interesting thing. Usually, when I say the synoptic gospels, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are three that share a bunch of stories, and then John is kind of a weird outlier. So it's weird to have a story that shows up in John and the other gospels, but it happens sometimes. Alex says, in verse 6, the difference, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. Yeah, so you've got dreadfully tormented, and this one says in terrible distress. So there's this person, this servant is at home, and they're really sick. We don't know why. We don't know what kind of sickness it is. We just know that they're really sick, paralyzed in some way. That's what we have about the centurion servant so far. So the second question I want to ask, if you don't have any more translation differences, is where do you see fear of rejection or fear of judgment here? Where do you see maybe some nervousness or some sense of like being a little bit worried about Jesus, what Jesus is going to say or what Jesus is going to think? Where do you see this happening? Alex says, verse 8. So verse 8 says, the centurion answered, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. Yeah, that's the point also that I was like, interesting. So why do you think the centurion says this? Yeah, what's going on here? Aiden says the same thing when Jesus talks about going to his home. Why does the centurion say this? Can you make any guesses as to why the centurion might say this to Jesus about, you don't even need to come to my house. You can just say the word from here. He explains it a little bit. He explains his thinking a little bit. But I wonder what you all think about what's going on with this particular centurion. If it was him specifically, like, is this thing any centurion would have said? Is it specific to this particular person? What's going on here? Conrad says, trying to make it easier. That could be. So the idea might be that like the centurion notices that Jesus is super busy and is followed around by a crowd of people all the time to try to be healed. So maybe the centurion's just trying to be like, hey, Jesus, you don't even have to take the time to come to my house. All you got to do is say the word. So that might be. Oh, yeah. And so that Jesus would be more likely to help him. So, yeah. So maybe the thing is that he that he is like, it's not even going to take you that long. Like, Jesus, you don't even have to take the time to come to my house. Like, you could do this really fast so that you can get on with your day. And then he's hoping that maybe that will be more likely. That might be it. Robin says he sees him a great leader of sorts and didn't want to bother him personally. Yeah, so when the centurion first comes up, he says, Lord, my servant is lying at home. Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. So he's clearly seeing that he's like addressing Jesus in a way that puts Jesus in this sort of position of power. So yeah, maybe he's trying to like not bother him. He's trying to be like really deferential. That seems legit. Aiden says, his occupation maybe made people a bit apprehensive to help. So that's a good way of thinking about it. So the centurion, if you're not familiar with a centurion, they were one of Rome's, centurions were Roman soldiers, and the name centurion means that they were ahead. Cent means 100, so they were ahead of 100 people. I think I've got that right, or is it 1,000? It's either 100 or 1,000 people, but I think it's 100. Because cent makes sense when we think about 100 cents in a dollar and we use the same Roman words. So a centurion is ahead of a bunch of people, right? He's a soldier. So maybe the soldier, the centurion, this guy in charge of a bunch of troops and who is he works for Rome, right? So like Rome is an occupying force at the time. Rome is an occupying power. So maybe the centurion thinks like this person, this Jesus, who is, not of my people, might be a little bit nervous about helping me and might not want to help me. So maybe that's what's going on. Anita says there's a reversal of roles in the sense that the centurion, as a Roman, could have demanded Jesus attend the serve at peace. He's taking a submissive role. Yeah, so that might be. So, like, yeah, technically, Jesus is a Israelite peasant, right? And the centurion is a soldier of Rome with a bunch of people under his command. He could have just said, all right, I'm going to command all my soldiers to grab Jesus and bring him to my house, right? He could have just sort of taken the very strict physical, like, I have physical power over you, I'm going to put you over here kind of role. But instead he asks, which is interesting. Dan says that it could be a recognition of the fact that Jews were not allowed to mingle with Gentiles. So that's one possible explanation for why the centurion says you don't have to come into my house, because there could have been some regulations about Jews coming into the house of Gentiles. So if the Roman soldier, or if the centurion was a Gentile soldier, then there might have been some cleanliness rules around that. There are also some scholars that say that that wasn't a rule at the time, that it would have been fine to go into the house of a Gentile as long as you, for instance, didn't eat there. So there's some like speculation about whether or not that really would have been a rule that people would have applied to. The other thing that might be interesting to think about is that the centurion could have actually been an Israelite working for Rome. And that was uncommon, but it did happen, that Rome would conscript essentially people who were Jews into the Roman army. So it could have been that this guy wasn't even a Gentile. We don't know. We don't have anything in the text that tells us that. But moving over into the John story, which we're not going to read, John's version of this story says that he's a Gentile, and that the Jewish leaders sort of vouch for him and say, like, we know he's a Gentile, we know he's a Roman centurion, but he's a good guy, right? So in Matthew's story that we're reading, we don't get that background, but in John you do. Steven says, your videos have been helpful in figuring out being trans and Christian. Aw, yay. I believe Jesus was able to see how strong his faith is. Yeah, so we've got this centurion that is sort of coming up, and Jesus might not want to help him, and maybe he's a little bit nervous about that, but Jesus sees something in him, right? Yay, Nikki, I'm glad you're joining in. It's okay that you're late. It's okay to come in late. For those that have been joining recently, we're talking about the fear of rejection and what that looks like in the gospel. So we're reading the story of the Roman centurion who comes to Jesus and says, please heal my servant, but you don't even have to come to my house. And Dan says, also, the nature of the relationship between the centurion and his slave may not have been considered to be in compliance with Levitical law. So here's an interesting thing to look at. Yeah, it's true that it might have been that the centurion might have been thinking like, well, the servants or the slaves that we have within Roman contexts were not allowed within Jewish or Hebrew contexts. So that might have been another reason that the centurion might have been a little nervous about Jesus meeting his slave or healing his slave. The other thing is that some folks have read this story and noticed that the word that's used for the centurion's servant in this story is also a word, it's pais is the word in Greek. And it's a word that essentially means young man. And it's usually used in biblical contexts to mean younger man or even child. It's used in a couple of instances where Jesus is talking about children. So within the biblical context, that's usually where we see it. But within the ancient Greek context, the ancient Greek and Roman context, it was also used, the word pais was also used for somebody's younger same gender lover. So that makes it complicated. So without, like, outside the biblical context that's used, it's kind of like, if you wanted to give like a modern day equivalent, it'd be like calling your significant other baby, right? Like, you don't actually mean baby. And in fact, it's a little weird that we use the word baby for significant other in some ways. But that's essentially what the word pais does in ancient Greek literature. And Dan says, yes, that's what I was pointing to. Yeah. So it's possible. Some people have read this story and said, this is not actually about a a centurion and his servant necessarily. It might be more about the centurion and his same gender partner, except probably not a partner, because this is still within the Greek system where there was not equality between same gender partners most of the time. It was usually an older person and a younger person. And so in like looking at it from our point of view, from our context, it would not necessarily be a consenting relationship between two adults. So that's why this is complicated, is because it might theoretically look like a queer relationship, but it might not be the kind of queer relationship that people have today. So that's why this is complicated, but it's definitely a something interesting to think about, the idea that the centurion might have been in a same gender relationship and that Jesus doesn't comment on that, regardless of what that relationship looked like and the laws around it. If that was the case, interesting. Again, I want to say is it in the John version? I think it's in the John version of this story. The centurion specifically says, this slave that I am like extremely fond of. Like he expresses his emotion toward this person. And so that's another reason why people think maybe there was a relationship between the centurion and his slave or his servant. So this is complex stuff, and it's definitely not the kind of thing that we can look at and be like, aha, a gay person, because it's not like a one-to-one equal, like gay as we understand it today versus a relationship that they would have understood it then are different. So we can't just be like, that's what it is now. But it does look like it might have been a same gender relationship in some fashion. So that's that. I wonder what other, like, those are all really great reasons for why Jesus, or why rather the centurion might have been nervous around Jesus. I think, like, when I read this story, sometimes I read it and I think that I often feel the same way about my relationship with God, where I think like, I want to go out to where God is and I want to meet God. And then God's like, oh, cool, I'll just come to your house then. And I'm like, no, I don't actually want you to come that close. Like, I'm a little nervous about you still. Like, you don't actually have to come to my house. You don't actually have to come into where I am. You stay out there and I'll come to you, right? And I wonder a little bit if that might be what's going on for the centurion a little, regardless of the reason, whether it's because of like his relationship, or because of his identity with Rome, or because he was a Gentile, or because, or because he didn't want to bother Jesus. Like, these are all very possible. But the sort of end result is like, no, you don't have to come over here. I'll come to you. You don't have to come over here. And I think that's a really interesting sort of reaction that he has. The thing that he says about, I have people that I can order to do stuff and they do it, and I trust that you have the power to order stuff and it will happen. That moment of faith that Jesus really sort of grabs onto and goes, this guy gets it. That's a really understandable, I think. I think you can be a little bit nervous and afraid of something, but only if you believe that that thing has power, right? Like, you wouldn't be nervous and afraid around something that wasn't a little bit powerful. Like, for instance, I would not be super nervous around a bunny, even though a bunny could bite me. I feel like I could handle a rabbit bite, right? But I might be a little bit nervous around a lion because a lion could mess you up. So I think you have to believe that something has a little bit of power before you're nervous around it. And I think that's what's going on here, is that the centurion is like, hey, I'm a little nervous, but I recognize that you have the power to do what you say you're going to do. And Jesus kind of says, like, okay, you don't have to necessarily, like, I think Jesus is kind of saying, like, he's on the path to getting it in a way that other people don't get it, even with that fear. And I think maybe that in some way can say something to us about, like, we don't have to, if we're a little bit nervous, it's okay. It's okay to be a little bit nervous. And I wonder if maybe that's a little bit what this passage is saying to me. So I wonder if it's maybe saying similar things to you. Stephen says, I understand that anxiety and I feel it too. It's a great point. Sometimes approaching God, even with the simplest of things, can make us anxious. Yeah. So sometimes you're just like, oh, I don't even know if I should be saying this or asking this or thinking this, right? And I think one of the things that I kind of like about this story is that it seems like the centurion, in a way, like puts up a boundary where about what he's comfortable with. He kind of says like, no, you don't have to, it's okay. You don't have to, like, here's the boundary, right? And I'm going to stay back here. You stay over there. And Jesus seems to respect that boundary. Jesus seems to respect the sort of consent needed to cross a boundary like that. And I think that's really cool that Jesus is like, okay, I won't come to your house. I don't want to freak you out, right? You have faith, and I'm not going to overstep the boundary that you're setting, but I will heal this person that you have asked me to heal. The other thing that I wonder might strike a point with us is, this is true for me, and maybe it's true for you too. I am way more okay advocating for somebody else than for myself. And I wonder if maybe the centurion maybe would not have come to Jesus if it was about his own health. It's because it's about the health of this person that he cares about that he really makes this leap and is like, okay, I'm going to go see this person who is a little bit scary, right? And so I think maybe that's something that's going on here too, is that it's easier for us sometimes to move toward things, to move toward God when we're thinking about other people than for ourselves. Yeah, and Alex and Golden Heart and Aiden are all on board with this. Yeah, I think it's easier to ask God for help with other people, right, than for ourselves. And so I think that might also be something to take into consideration in this story. So hang on, what were the other questions I wanted to ask about this with you? Yeah, I think we got most of them. I think this is just one of those stories that is interesting because it's a situation where somebody comes and asks Jesus for help, but does seem pretty nervous and worried about being rejected. And so when I read it, I see myself a little bit too. I'm like, oh, I understand. Like, you don't want to let people a little too close because then they might reject you, right? And he's a little worried about that for whatever reason. And so Jesus recognizes that, but also answers, like, he gives the centurion what the centurion wants, right? And I think that is an interesting way to leave that story. There's part of me that wants to be like, Jesus, just go, like, just override that boundary. Just like tell a man that it's okay and you're going to come to his house anyway, right? There's a part of me that wants that. But I think it's cool to see Jesus respecting that boundary in this story. And it reminds me of another story that we're not going to talk about today, but I did do a trans and Christian video on it. So if you search YouTube for trans and Christian and Zacchaeus, you'll find it. But the story of Zacchaeus is one where Jesus does say, like, hey, you who are nervous about meeting me, you climbed a tree because you wanted to see me from far away. Well, I'm going to come to your house. So I think that's another example. That's an example of a story where Jesus is like, oh, you're a little nervous, you're a little concerned, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to make this okay. So the story of Zacchaeus is another one that we might talk about in this sort of larger category. But since I made a trans and Christian video on it, I thought I would leave that one over there for y'all to go check out on your own. Let's talk about the second story about fear of rejection. That one is in Luke chapter 8. So we're turning from Matthew chapter 8 to Luke chapter 8, which is interesting because I think last time we did a Bible study, we did we do James chapter 2 and what was it, Ephesians chapter 2? I forget. We did 2 chapter 2s last time. This time we're going to do 2 chapter 8s. So Luke chapter 8 is where we're going for our next thing. And while we're getting there, if you have any other thoughts about this centurion story, put them in the chat because I'd be interested to know. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn to Luke 8. And I'm going to have a drink of water. Bye, Alex. It was good to see you. I hope your kitty's doing okay. All right. So Luke chapter 8 is where we're going. And we're going to read, we're actually coming in mid-verse here. We're going to read the second part of verse 42. So verse 42 through 48. And this is the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. And we're going to read this story. This story is another one that shows up in multiple Gospels, but I'm picking the Luke one because I think it's a little bit, it's concise, so it's easy to read. So we're going to read Luke chapter 8, verse 42 through 48. And I'm actually going to start mid verse 42 because it's finishing up a different story. So, as Jesus went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So this is a story of a woman coming to Jesus for healing, but not even asking, like not being able to ask. She came up behind him and touched his clothes. And that was it. Other versions of this story, you get sort of the woman's inner monologue where she says, "If I can only touch his clothes, I will be healed," right? You get that inner version of what she's saying to herself. In this version of the story, we don't get that inner monologue. We just get what happens sort of from the external view. But she comes up behind Jesus. She's been bleeding for 12 years, and she's spent everything she had on doctors. Nobody could do anything. She comes up behind Jesus and touches the fringe of his clothes. This moment is so funny to me when Jesus is like, "Who touched me?" Especially if you are familiar at all with the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is a little bit more ornery than in some of the other Gospels, but he also he seems very human in the Gospel of Mark. And so we get the same thing where Jesus goes, "Who touched me?" And you get the sense that like Jesus honestly does not know what's going on, that he is just kind of like, what is happening? In this Luke version of the story, Jesus does know what's going on. He says, "Power has gone out of me." But he still has this question, like, "Who touched me?" And you kind of go like, Jesus, don't you know? Like, don't you know already the answer to this question? And so we're not told in the Luke version of the story whether Jesus really does know who touched him or not. And he's just like, needs somebody to come forward. But maybe he didn't. I don't know. But it's always kind of a funny thing when Jesus has a question like that seems so human. Stephen says, "Yesterday, one of my pastors preached on this passage, and the biggest takeaway from this is we should be praying with desperation. There will be doubt, but pray wholeheartedly." There is definite desperation in this passage. This woman, like the amount of time that she has been sick, and the amount of money that she has spent on like trying to be healed, and it's not worked, does speak to the sense of desperation, right? The thing that really hits me about this passage is the way that she doesn't even, like, she can't even come face to face with Jesus. She's coming up behind him, right? Like she doesn't come to him and ask for healing. She can't even, it's like she doesn't even want to be seen by him. She's behind him, right? And that sense of like desperation, but also fear, also like nervousness, like why did she not think that he would heal her, you know? Like that's the thing that's interesting about this passage is like where is her fear or nervousness or shame coming from? Because we're based on what Jesus says to her, that he calls her daughter and that nothing is mentioned about her being a Gentile, we can kind of assume that she's a Jew, right? And like she is a woman, and there were specific laws about how men and women could interact in certain contexts. But there would have been nothing stopping her from talking to Jesus except other men who might have told her to shut up. Like, other than that, like, and I shouldn't say other than that, like, it's nothing. Like, that would have been a problem probably, because Jesus was surrounded by a bunch of dudes all the time. But like, she could have theoretically come and talked to him, and she didn't. She kind of was like nervous, right? Yeah, so Robin says, would her sickness make her unclean? Right. So there is a theory about this that, like, because she was hemorrhaging blood, and because blood was essentially like a dangerous subject, right? Within the Mosaic law, or the Levitical law, or Levitical codes, if you were bleeding, it was you were seen as unclean. But unclean is not the best word for it, because it was really more like unsafe. Like, life was so wrapped up in blood. Like, people understood that you need blood to be alive, that if you were bleeding, it usually meant that you were sick, right? And so, like, if you were bleeding, and it was not, like, especially if people couldn't figure out why you were bleeding, it was seen as very dangerous. And especially, and here's the other thing, we're not told whether the hemorrhage that she has, if it's something related to her reproductive organs, because if it was, that has another layer of regulation on it, because women's periods were regulated in a very specific way under Levitical law and Mosaic law. So if it was like she had a hemorrhage from some other part of her body, there would be different rules, right? So there's also that going on, that it could be that she was afraid to be near Jesus because of if she was like essentially unclean, and so she shouldn't touch anybody, right? Yeah. So Anita says, as a Jew, she would be considered in a state of uncleanness. Yeah, so we just talked about that. As a woman, she could also be potentially prevented from talking to a male that she was not related to without a male protector. So that's possible. It depends on, there are some interpretations that would agree with that, Anita. There are other interpretations that say that, like, realistically, that was not really how things worked in this period of time, that she would have, like, a woman would be able to talk to a man without another man around. She just wouldn't have been able to be like alone in a room with another man. So it's all kind of complicated because we don't know exactly how things were, right? But yeah, there would be some barriers between her talking to a guy and being able to talk in a public place. There's also, with the hemorrhaging thing, if she was considered unclean for whatever reason, she also might not want to be in spaces with a bunch of other people, right? Because then she could theoretically make a lot of people uncomfortable and worry about their cleanliness status, right? So, like, it's some people have said that she was essentially sneaking up behind Jesus because she didn't want anybody to know she was there, because it would have been like, if she'd been sick for 12 years and this is a small community, everybody would have known that she was sick, right? Everybody, like, unless she was like sort of disguising herself and going quietly, people would have known and been like, hey, what are you doing out here, right? So that might be another reason why she didn't go up to Jesus and just straight up ask, is that she was trying to sort of conceal her identity in some way. And that would be another reason why she didn't speak out right away. When Jesus is like, who touched me? She doesn't say anything, right? And it might be because she doesn't want to be known, right? She doesn't want people to know who she is, because if they figure out who she is, they're going to be like, hey, you're not supposed to be here, right? So I think this moment where I think that's what it is about this story that speaks to me in this sort of fear of rejection moment, is that she's afraid to be known, right? She's afraid to make herself known. She doesn't make herself known to Jesus or to anybody else there. She may have been like intentionally concealing who she is so that people don't say, hey, you're not supposed to be here. And if you, like me, have been a queer person, a trans person, a gay person, who has gone into a church service just because you're like, I really want to go to church, and you sit in like the last pew, and then you dart out of church really quickly afterwards so that nobody says anything to you. Like that's that moment, right? That moment of like, I just need to be here. I just need to be near God for whatever reason, because you believe that God will be there in that moment with you and for you. And yet you can't let yourself be fully known or fully seen because you're afraid of that rejection, right? You're afraid of the other people around you. You're afraid of what God will think or how you will feel, right? Like all of those moments are things that I think a lot of queer people experience in religious space. We're afraid, we're anticipating people's negative reactions. That's actually something that was, we have some data on, because in the 2015 US trans survey, it's the largest survey of trans folks ever done. There was a question about, or there were several questions about faith experiences. And one of the questions was like, have you left a faith community because these lists of negative things have happened to you? And you can say like yes or no. And then there was another question that said, have you left a faith community because you've been afraid of these things happen to, like, are you afraid that they will happen to you? And a bunch of people said yes to that. A bunch of people said that they have left faith communities not because the thing has happened, but because they're afraid of the thing happening. And so this fear of rejection is like a big thing for a lot of trans folks and for a lot of queer folks in general, but we have data on the trans folks, so that was the thing that I thought of immediately. So that's where this woman, I think, is living, is this moment where she's afraid to be seen, afraid to be known, and she needs healing. She's desperate for that healing and desperate for that closeness to Jesus, but she can't let herself be known, right? Because then she could be rejected. Jesus could take the healing away. Like imagine you're sick for 12 years and you finally get healed, and then you're like, oh no, like now I'm gonna lose it, right? So that's what's going on in the second bit of the passage. So I want to read this again. Jesus says, someone touched me, for I noticed the power had gone out from me. When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. So it's in this moment where Jesus is like, hey, what happened? Who was this? And I wonder what you all think. Do you think Jesus really didn't know who she was and what was going on? Do you think he was asking, like he wanted somebody to come forward? And like he did know, but he wanted to make it public? Like, what do you think's going on here with Jesus? Why is he asking this question? Why is he kind of making somebody out themselves in this way? What's going on here? Anybody have any thoughts? It's kind of it's a weird question theologically about like whether Jesus knows everything or not. But it's also a weird and interesting question when it comes to why would Jesus want her to make herself known? Except I do have one theory, but I want to see what you all think first. And he just says, I don't think that he knew, but at the same time, I think it was important to the wholeness of the healing for her to identify herself. Yeah, so that's a little bit of what I kind of came to on this passage too, is that I wonder two things. One, if part of the healing might have been being seen, like Jesus, like she's so afraid of being seen and being known. And so maybe part of the healing was being seen and being known and it being okay. That maybe part of like, if Jesus had not said, hey, who was that? And then seen her, she would have always been afraid. Maybe she would have always been afraid after that. She would have been like, gosh, good thing I got away with that. Because if he would have known who I was or seen me, things would have been worse. Like she would have held that fear. And I wonder if maybe part of the healing was the healing of knowing that she could approach God and she could approach Jesus, right? And that she could be healed and that she could be seen and that she would still be okay. I wonder if the healing there might have been part of that fear. Aiden says, maybe you wanted to make it known that anybody can approach him regardless of who they are. Yeah, so maybe it was Jesus essentially saying, who touched me? I want to make a point of this so that everybody knows, no matter who comes to me, I'm going to heal them and it's going to be okay, right? So maybe it was a little bit of a lesson for the crowd too. Anita says, I think that being trans teaches us the importance of being seen for healing. Yeah, I think you're right, Anita. I think what I got from what you said, and tell me if this is wrong, but that I think when we, like, if we're trans, we recognize how important it is to be seen as who we are, and that being seen is important for our healing, right? For our healing as people, and as spiritual beings too, I think. Not healing from being trans, just to specify, but like healing from a lot of the negative stuff that we internalize and that we have thrown at us because we're trans. Robin says, oh, if she was seen and known, that she could be brought back into the community. Yeah, and then Aiden says, freeing her of shame by showing who she is and that she could be just as worthy as anyone else. Yes, so this was the second part of the thing that I think might be going on, is that part of what you would do within this cleanliness law is that once you are healed of whatever the thing is that's making you unclean, or once the unclean thing is over, then you're supposed to go to the religious authorities and they declare, like, yes, you are clean. You're officially ready to rejoin everybody. And I wonder if that might have been what was going on here with Jesus and this woman, is that he wanted her to make herself known within the crowd so that the community could know her and see her as somebody who is healed and is okay. And I wonder if that might be a little bit of what's going on too, is that it wasn't just Jesus wanting her wanting to see her himself. It was that he wanted the community to see her and go, oh, she's better, she's okay, she can be part of our community again. Like, he needed witnesses to say, like, cool, everything's good now. And I wonder if that might have been a little bit of it too. Yeah, and I like what you said there, Aiden, about showing her she is just as worthy as anyone else. That, like, I think that goes hand in hand with what I said before about, like, if she had been healed and then left, and she would have felt like, so this is another example of, like, the church sitting in church thing, right? Like, have you ever, as somebody who is queer or trans, if you are somebody who passes, right, and we can talk about passing all day and how helpful that term is or not, but if you are somebody who looks like you're straight and maybe cis, or cis and maybe straight, either way, like I pass a lot of the time, right? You a lot of the time have this fear that if people only knew what was really going on, they would hate you, right? And I think a lot of people have this too. If you are in a situation where you can't come out, or you don't want to come out, or you haven't come out, you get this fear of, like, oh, if only they really knew, then they would feel differently, right? And I feel like that would be what would happen to this woman if she had been healed by touching Jesus's clothing and then left. She would have spent her whole life being like, oh, thank goodness I got away with it, because if he had really known, he never would have healed me, right? It's that sense of, like, if they really knew, they wouldn't love me anymore. It's that fear. And I think she could have had that if Jesus had not called her out and said, like, hey, who was that? And then she has to stand up and say, like, it was me and I did it because of this. And then to have Jesus say, cool, fine, yes. And for him to love her in that moment took away some of that fear maybe for her. Yeah, Anita says, a feeling of if people only knew haunted me until I realized I was trans. Yeah, it's a thing. It's a real thing that a lot of us deal with. Hi, Irene. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Aiden says, my exact thoughts in church, even though my church is affirming. I know, sometimes that it's a really hard thing to let go, right? Which is why I wanted us to talk about it a little bit tonight. That fear of if they only knew, or the fear of prepping for rejection, is huge. And if your life if that's a big part of what's going on in your head for a long time in your life, then it takes a really long time to unlearn it too. And so I think it's something that we need to talk about more, because it's only in being fully seen and being loved anyway, that fear kind of goes away. And that's what's going on at the end of this text. I love what Jesus says at the end, where he says, he calls her daughter. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace. So in that moment, it's like Jesus is identifying her not just as a good person who has faith, but as somebody who is now part of his family. He's like taking her in as part of his family now. And I really appreciate that. It's like the extra amount of love that she needed in that moment. And I think it's the kind of love that we need, right? When we're fully seen, when we come forward and we went, okay, I just really need this. And to have somebody be like, I know, it's okay. And I will give it to you. And I will give you what you need, right? To have that kind of love from God is like amazing. It's amazing. It's so amazing that we oftentimes don't know if we can really believe it, right? It takes us a while to believe it. Yeah. Aiden says this fear can also stem from being forced to be uprooted from an unaffirming church. Yeah, and having fear of rejection from faith community. Yeah, it sucks. It sucks, y'all. I feel you. Yeah. So this fear that we have is not unfounded fear. It's not fear that doesn't have a very legitimate backing. It's just that that fear that we have that stems from negative experiences with people does not have to extend and like be extrapolated so that we have these fears about God. That's what I'm trying to get to with all of this, is that we can have negative experiences with people that are well-founded and we need to be careful, but we don't have to think that God is just like those people. We don't have to be afraid of God and afraid of Jesus in the way that we have to be cautious around people. And it sucks that we have to be cautious around people, but we don't have to feel that way around God. And I think that's what's going on with both the centurion and this woman, is that they're fearful about being fully seen and fully known, and still getting the healing and closeness that they desire and that they need. But they don't have to be afraid of Jesus when it comes to that, because Jesus is way better than all the other people, right? Jesus gets it. And Jesus wants to give that love and wants to give that healing in a completely different and bigger way. So the last text that I want us to just look at really quickly before we go is the text that came to me while I was thinking about this. I was thinking about like this fear of God, and like sometimes thinking like, oh, I don't know if I can really like let go enough to trust God, to trust that God loves me, to trust that God wants me close, to trust that God knows me, to let go of that sort of like, oh, if they only knew, to be fully seen, right? Because God already fully sees us. God already fully knows us. And so it's like the fear and the protections that we put up and the walls we put up are so unnecessary because they're not going to keep God out, but we still build them up sometimes because we're nervous and we're scared, right? So I was thinking like, what does the Bible say about being in this position where we're a little bit scared and a little bit nervous about God? And what does the Bible say about God's relationship to us? So the last text that we're going to look at, it's just a little short one. It's Matthew 7, verses 7 through 11. So they all rhyme. Matthew 7, verses 7 through 11. So this is actually just the chapter before the centurion servant. So that's what we're going to look at. So Golden Heart, that's a good question. Golden Heart says, what do we do when we love our brothers and sisters but also fear them? Yeah, that's a good, I think that ties into, we're going to do a different Bible study on what do we do when we disagree with other Christians, especially about big theological issues. So that's going to be coming up in one of our next Bible studies. So I think we'll probably tie that question in there as well. So Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. And this is the classic ask, seek, knock passage. But it's the one that I immediately thought of when I thought about like how we relate to God in terms of like Yeah, how we relate to God. That's that. So Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 11 go like this. Ask and it will be given you. Search and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. And for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So, this little passage here, I think, speaks to the two stories that we just heard, right? Because both the centurion and the woman with the hemorrhage, they asked and they sought, and the centurion asked and the woman sought, I think is a good way to put that. She couldn't ask, but she still was seeking, right? She still was looking. And they got what it was that they needed, right, from Jesus. They got that moment, they got the healing, and they got the moment of being known. And then the last bit, is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone, or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? This idea of God as a loving parent, I know a lot of us, we've talked about this before, a lot of us have like mixed feelings about the God as parent thing. But the visual of God as this sort of caregiver, and this caregiver is not going to give us the thing that hurts us when we are desperately seeking, right? When we are desperately looking for something. Yeah, so Robin says, what's sad is that I know people who would give snakes or stones. Yes, exactly. So that's exactly what the problem is here, is that we are formulating our ideas of God based on our understanding of people, right? And we go, oh yeah, I know some bad parents, whether they're our parents or other parents. We're a little bit like, I know some people that would do that, right? And so the problem is that we think about that and then we go, oh, God must be like that. Because like that's kind of how we extrapolate, right? As we think about other people, we think about ourselves, and then we just go, okay, that but bigger, and then that's God. But that's not how God works. Jesus says, like even the best parents, even the parents that are wonderful and give their kids everything they need, God is better than that. Like God is like orders of magnitude better than that. But like even so in those moments where we're like, oh, I don't know if I should ask for this. I don't know if I want to be fully seen or fully known by God, because then God might not love me anymore, right? We have these fears, and for Jesus to say, hey, you know what? God is not going to give you a thing that is going to hurt you when you are just asking for love. And that's complicated, of course, because bad things happen in the world, and it's easy for us to be like, oh, is this God punishing me? And like we have that concern, right? But what Jesus says here is that God does not hurt you just to hurt you. And God does not, like, when you are opening up to be seen and to be known, like just being completely open, God is not going to like smack you. Like, I know that we have that fear, and we may have that fear because of what other people have done to us, but God is not like that. What Jesus is trying to say is that God is not like that. God doesn't do that. And so I think this set of verses can speak to the reason that it is okay to trust that God isn't going to reject us. The reason that it's okay to trust God is because God is this loving force that sees people as they are and loves them as they are and gives them the things that they need. Like, and that's like a really wild statement to make when you think about it. And I'm like nervous even making that statement, but that's what we're seeing happening in these stories. And that's huge, that God is a God that can see all of us and still love us exactly as much as when God was only seeing the good parts. You know, it's a little bit like the first date thing where like people are like, oh yeah, the first date you go and you meet somebody and you only present the good parts, and then it takes years for them to see all the bad parts too, right? But with God, God sees all the good parts and all the bad parts, and God loves you exactly the same, which is wild when you think about it. Nothing that you can hide or hold back is going to get in the way of that love that God has for you in your entirety. And the reason for that is because you are made by God in your entirety, right? There is nothing about you that is not loved. And that's huge. Anita says, to me, the boldest statement of faith is to say that God loves us and actually seeks us. Yeah, I think that's something that, like, that's that centurion moment, right? The centurion was kind of like, well, I'll go seek you, but you don't have to come over here. And I think that bold movement of recognizing that God wants to move toward us, and we just have to say, okay, God, come on over. Like, come on over to my house, God. Like, that's huge, right? That requires a huge movement of faith. Like, Jesus was amazed at the centurion's faith, but like that movement of like, yeah, come on in, come see all of my mess is like an even huger movement. It's an even bigger movement of faith. And I think that's the kind of faith that we're sort of called to. And I think that it's kind of the faith that LGBT people show the world in a way that other people don't get. We're the ones that have been told, for a lot of us, for our whole lives, that we're all messed up. And for us to be like, come on in, God, to this messed up life that I have, or this messed up place that I live in. Like, we exemplify that kind of faith to the world, that it's okay to be fully seen and to still be fully loved. And so I think that's a good example that we can show other people who might not understand or know that yet. People might be able to come to us and be like, well, if they can be fully seen and fully loved, then I can be fully seen and fully loved. And that's the kind of like freedom, you experiencing freedom to free other people, that we're called to, I think, as Christians. So that's the Bible study. I know I did a lot of spieling. I did a lot of soapboxing tonight. So thanks for bearing with me as I talked a lot. But I hope that it helped. And I'm glad that a couple of folks, Golden Heart and Aiden, and a couple other folks, that this is resonating with them. Thank you to all of you for talking back and being involved in the chat. Thank you for that great little summary at the end there, Anita. That was great. I'm really glad that you were all here. This is always fun to do. And I think it's something, I think this topic was just something that had been kind of on my heart, and so I wanted to share it with you all and to talk a little bit about it. So thanks for indulging me in this topic. Let me think if there are any announcements. Regular announcements are the Patreon page is always up. And if you want to become a supporter over at Patreon, I really appreciate that. You help make Bible studies like this happen. You also help subsidize things so that I can go talk to churches and do in-person studies with folks that need it. So if you want to join the Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/AustinLionheart. And then thanks to all the patrons that are already patrons that are making this happen. If you're patrons in the chat, I really appreciate you. And then our next, our next Bible study is going to be, so we're going to be flipping this around. So next week, the 16th, will be our Trans and Christian support group for anybody who's gender expansive, gender queer, trans, non-binary, and Christian. You can sign up at bit.ly/trans Christian support. And that'll be our next group on the 16th. On the 23rd, I'm going to be gone, actually, because I'm going to be speaking that night someplace. I don't even remember where I'm going that night. Oh, I'm going to be in Milwaukee that night speaking. So no Bible study on the 23rd, but we're going to have our next one on the 30th. So September 30th is going to be our next Bible study. So I think those are all the announcements. And thanks for being here. We'll see you next time. Have a good evening, everybody. Peace.